I've added a second test to the test fixture. This one passes in 2 restaurant reviews to the restaurant rater. Since the code is starting to take some form, I've also given the test some names: computes result for 1 review and computes result for 2 reviews. I've also changed the implementation inside of the restaurant rater, and the simplest possible thing I found to work is a very simple link statement. It averages the reviews. The good news is both of these tests pass, and now I'm in a refactoring stage. I think the restaurant rater is in good shape so far, but it's the tests that are bothering me. One thing you'll learn about unit testing in general is that the tests are just as important as the application code, and it bothers me that I have so much setup work inside of each test to make a restaurant and its reviews. So in this refactoring phase, I'm going to refactor the test to make that setup a little bit easier. What I've done to refactor the tests is add a method named buildRestaurantForReview. This method takes a variable number of integer parameters and uses some link operators to turn them into a list of reviews, then attach the reviews to the restaurant and return the restaurant. I can use this method in my tests by either creating an array of integers and passing them into this method, as we did here with a single value of 4, or we can use the params ability of C# to pass them in as parameters like we do in the second test. I'm feeling a bit better about these tests, and both tests are still passing, which is good. But the next step I want to take is not to start testing boundary conditions and odd numbers, which would all be good tests to write, but I'm sure I can come up with an implementation to satisfy all these odd scenarios I can dream up inside of a test. Instead, I want to focus on design issues first, because remember, TDD is primarily about design, and if I look at these requirements, they say we have to support 2 different types of averaging. There is a simple average and there is a weighted average. I want to see what happens if I try to introduce the second form of averaging and see how it impacts my design. What I've done is add a new test to test the weighted average of 2 reviews. Remember, the requirement said I need to weight the most recent reviews twice as heavily as the oldest reviews, and I know I haven't worked with review dates and sorting yet, but I can write some tests to make sure that the reviews are properly sorted before we compute the rating. I can do that later. I'm sure sorting is another implementation detail I can figure out. I'm still focused on design. In this weighting test, the rating for a restaurant with review ratings of 3 and 9 is 5, because the value 3 is more heavily weighted than the value 9. I've put together a quick and dirty implementation that will pass the test, and of course I did that after I watched the test fail. This is what the implementation looks like, and now I'm in the refactoring phase again. And the code to compute the weighted average is sure something I could refactor and clean up and optimize, but again, that's a detail I'll worry about just a little bit later. And one thing I know that I'll need to clean up is how to deal with rounding. Right now, I'm truncating the average rating. So the link statement computes the average rating and casts it to an int. And the weighted average also performs division using 2 int values and truncates the result. So the question is truncating the right behavior? This is one of those ideal scenarios where a unit test might lead you to go back and ask a question to the owner or the product manager and ask for clarification. All I know so far is that the overall rating is supposed to be a whole number. So I need to clarify the exact behavior, and once I have an answer, I can write tests that make sure that the rounding or the truncating happens correctly. But for right now, I still want to think about higher level design issues and come back to handling simple averages versus weighted averages. One thing that bothers me about this restaurant rater is how it is now responsible for both computing a simple rate and also computing a weighted rate. And I know, based on my notes, that this is an area that can change. I might need to add new algorithms in the future, and I'd like to make those changes as easy as possible. Let me do a bit more refactoring, and I can see if I can make it easier to change algorithms while still having my tests pass. It's wonderful that I have these passing tests now because I can rip the code apart, rebuild it, and my tests will tell me if I did anything wrong. I've done a bit of refactoring, and I've decided that the restaurant rater should not be responsible for computing the actual result. Instead, the rater is going to rely on an algorithm that is passed in and abstracted behind an interface definition. The interface definition is iRating algorithm, and the definition looks like this. You pass the algorithm a list of reviews, and it will return a rate result. Now I've made two concrete implementations of this interface. One implementation performs a simple averaging of the reviews, and the other implementation performs the weighted averaging of the reviews. You might notice that the code inside these algorithms is essentially the code I had before, I just moved it around. I took code out of the restaurant rater and pasted it into these new algorithm classes. Is that good? I think so. Now, when a client wants to determine a rating, they don't have to decide which method to call on the restaurant rater. Instead, they always call compute rate, but they pass in the algorithm that's required to perform the computation. This is the strategy design pattern for you pattern fans out there. What's important about this pattern is how I can now introduce new algorithms without changing any of the code inside the restaurant rater or inside any of the existing algorithms. I've made the system much easier to extend, and we should be able to keep up with all the changes that the business wants to introduce in this area as they experiment with different ways to rate restaurants. And the best news is that all of the tests still pass, so I know I haven't broken anything. Of course, you might be wondering, if all I did was move code around, then why shouldn't I just call into the algorithm directly instead of using this rater class? In other words, if I'm a client, like the test is a client, why do I still instantiate a restaurant rater and call compute rate? And the answer is that we haven't given the restaurant rater all of the responsibilities that it needs to take care of just yet. Let me write another test and come right back. I've written a new test, this time to make sure that the restaurant rater only uses the top n number of reviews in a calculation. To test this scenario, I've built a restaurant with 6 reviews, 1, 1, 1, followed by 10, 10, 10, and I expect if I tell the rater to only use the first 3 reviews, it should produce an average of 1. If I build this, and we come out to the test runner, it'll reload that assembly, we'll run this, and we can see that that test fails. Let's go in and see if we can get this to pass. I think all I need to do is use the link take operator and pass in the number of reviews to use. So let me try introducing a take, pasting in that parameter, and now we can build again, and I can run the tests and all the tests pass. So now we can see that the restaurant rater is going to have a purpose. It needs to massage the data and have the data set up properly for the algorithm to work. So the rater can sort and partition the data, but it's still the algorithm that does the computations and leaves us open to extending the software with new algorithms. And at this point, I'm sure we could think of many more tests to write. We could write tests to check for rounding errors and truncating errors, tests for restaurants with no reviews, tests to make sure the reviews are sorted properly for averaging, and the list goes on. I'm not going to write those tests for you in this video. Instead, we're going to move on to looking at more MVC-specific issues around unit testing. But I hope I've shown you some of the benefits of TDD and how to apply test-driven development. It has a learning curve, and you need to keep trying and then learning and then trying again. You might think this example was too simplistic, but I assure you that after many years of doing this, if you can make your code easy to test, like in this example, and there's always a way to make code easier to test, then you're going to have success not only with test-driven development, but also in writing maintainable code.